Hello again, guys. It is iFree700. We are back with some Warhammer lore. This time, what the fuck is the War of Vengeance introduction? You see, the War of Vengeance is a very huge topic and a very interesting timeline in the Warhammer Fantasy universe. In fact, it's my favorite time. It is literally my favorite book. I love it. I love everything about it. Now, something that's very interesting about it is that, well, it's placed a long time before Sigmar, and a long time before the Archaon ever-chosen end-time scandal. For the exact estimates, it would be around 2,000 years prior to Sigmar's birth. Now, the interesting thing about the War of Vengeance is that the time it's set in is actually very fantastic. I love it. I love the way they build it up. So, let's talk about it. The War of Vengeance, prior to this incident, was when Chaos pretty much invaded the world, and the elves and the dwarves were barely holding on, and the lizardmen lost most of their empire. The only way that they won was because the elves did the Great Vortex ritual, which caused all the magical energies to get sucked out of the world and into this massive vortex. There's still a little bit of magic left, but not quite a bit. Now, up to this point, the dwarves and the elves never met each other. And everything that they've met have been bloodthirsty races. The dwarves have been from the lands of the lizardmen, and the lizardmen do not give them the time of day. They immediately attack them on sight for being intruders. The elves have met only demons and, of course, beastmen, lizardmen, and all of them are extremely hostile. So up to this point, these two races have never met a peaceful race. As far as they know, they're the only civilization out there. The elves are very arrogant and view themselves as superior to everybody, and they have a brief civil war over this called the Sundering. And during the Sundering, they were having a huge supremacy issue with Malekith trying to usurp the throne, but in a more basic sense is more about supremacy. What should the Hives do about their supremacy, since they're better than everybody? One of them, which would be Malekith, the Dark Elves, believed that they should exert their dominance over the lesser species and dominate their will and take over everybody, torture them, do whatever the fuck it is they please. The High Elves believe that it's their duty as the superior beings to protect everybody. Now, very few elves in particular would actually point out how similar the High Elves are to the Dark Elves. Imladric is one such high elf who we'll see a lot in the War of Vengeance, and he points at disgust to his own nobles and says, "You guys are fucking supremacists. You're just as bad as Malekith." And they get very offended. They go, "How dare you consider me like them? We're nothing like them." It's like, dude, you view the dwarves as mud people. You view that we're so much better than them. You can't even fathom the concept that maybe their way of living is slightly better than ours. Like, you're a supremacist by definition. It's like, holy crap. So this is a severe issue that the elves are dealing with. Now, the dwarves, on the other hand, they're dealing with something different. You see, hiding in their holes and declaring a more or less war and grudges against demons, they're more used to the different ideals of war, where instead of being a supremacist to everybody, instead they're like, okay, you beat my ass, you did anything to me, I'm going to charge out there with an army of boys and we're going to stomp the living shit out of your existence. Now, prior to the meeting of the two races officially, the two races have been dealing with inside issues. As I said, the High Elves have been dealing with the Civil War, the Sundering, and the Dwarves have been dealing with the Greenskins, which would be the Goblins and the Orcs, and the raving bands of Beastmen and stuff like that. Overall, the High King, Gotrek Starbreaker, very badass individual, by the way, I love him. He personally did a crusade and destroyed all the orcs and goblins in the Badlands. So, for many of the dwarves, he was viewed as a great king, a proud warrior, something that his son viewed him not so high of a regard. His son would be Snorri Halfhand. And Snorri Halfhand wished that his father was still the great warrior that he keeps hearing about, when reality is, his father just wants to stop war. He's like, I've fought in it, I've seen how bad it gets, I wish we don't go through another war again. But the younger dwarves and the more hot-headed elderly dwarves are quick to rouse to war. And that's something that Gotrek has to deal with, is the dwarves. Can they be tempered? Can they be quelled their aggression? Now, on the flip side, the High Elves, their king is Kalidor. Now, Kalidor is a pretty shitty king. Now, before you go off, just know that this is Kalidor the Second, which would mean he's the fourth Phoenix king that has ever arisen. And the thing about him is that he is kind of, how do I put this? He's an impulsive individual. He gives in to his own temptations. He's more concerned about what his next meal will be, and that it's the highest, most luxurious, exquisite stag that he's ever eaten, rather than worrying about, say, the diplomatic relations between the two races. This is the kind of person he is, and he views the dwarves as nothing but people who live in the mud, very disgusting individuals. He doesn't even fathom the idea that, hey, these people are very hardy people, they go through rough lives. Nope. He just views them as disgusting, pig-like people. And when it comes to his skills with a sword, he's a decent combatant. He's able to kill a dwarf if he has to. But he's not an amazing combatant. This is shown several times where he tries to flaunt a sword in front of his brother, Imladric. And Imladric just points at him and goes, hey, you dropped your sheath to your sword. You kind of did that wrong, you know that. Which, of course, makes Kalidor very angry with his brother. So it's kind of funny. On one hand, we have the elves who have a very, very shitty king who doesn't really know how to handle a situation that's delicate. And then we got, on the other hand, the dwarves who have a great, great king. The problem is, though, is that he's dealing with a very, very shitty people who are very warmongering. This is, of course, the first time they've met a peaceful race, and the only way they really know how to deal with anything is through fighting. So if one race does something bad to them, they want to get together a group of boys and stomp the shit out of him. So the High King has a lot on his plate to temper down all of the dwarves. As I said, this is a very interesting scenario indeed. You got a shitty king on one side with decent people, and then you got a really great king on one side, but his people are very bloodthirsty when it comes to being wronged. Now, during the War of Vengeance, we're going to see a lot of huge numbers of elves and dwarves. And we're talking about a lot of elves and dwarves. You see, in the War of Vengeance, there is more of the elves and dwarves because this is the peak of their civilization. This is when they were at the height. They had the most wealth, they had the most people, they had the most advances through technology and such. So they're a very sophisticated bunch. They don't have gunpowder yet, unfortunately, but they do have some amazing achievements. And one of the things is that every dwarven army would be around 5,000 or more. The lowest army we've seen is actually the Krakadrak dwarves, the Norse dwarves, where they came with an army of 2,000. But their army is a little bit different than everyone else's. Theirs is more two-hander axe crazy, yelling at the enemy as they grab them by the chest and bury the fucking axe in their head. Like, they're a little bit rowdy bunch compared to the rest of the dwarves. And we're going to see hundreds and hundreds of grudge throwers and ballistas. So you're going to see a lot of that. Now, for the elves, on the other hand, you're going to see a lot of dragons. A lot of dragons. And you're going to see thousands upon thousands of elves. Like, a tiny garrison of a town is 8,000 elves. That's quite a bit, considering that, you know, in more modern Warhammer Fantasy, the number is significantly less. So we're dealing with the greatest of the two species in massive numbers. That being said, the logistics is looking really good. Because again, the wealth is just insane. The amount of gold that dwarves had was ridiculous. There was so much gold that the dwarves had that a newly formed dwarven, the Scaranawe, the hill dwarves, the dwarves who pretty much colonized anywhere that wasn't a mountain, but instead like the hills or the grasslands, they would make so much money from trading that they would be able to have golden floors in their castles, or their kazads as they called it, which means fortress. So that's how rich both races were. Both races were extremely wealthy. Now you may think, well, what sparked this war? Well, it's actually Malekith's doing. And this is something that actually struck my heart quite a bit. You see, prior to this incident, Malekith, when he was a young elf, when he first met the dwarves, he realized, hey, you guys are killing chaos and beastmen, and you're killing orcs. That's what we're here to do too. I'm on this expedition throughout the world just to rid more chaos. So let's work together. In which case, the Dwarven High King at the time worked with Malekith, and they became very close friends. And the battles they had were just legendary. Legendary. Mind you, the Dwarven times, the Dwarven runesmiths were the greatest of their time. So the dwarves had massive golems that were inscribed with runes so they could stay working. So you had golems working with dwarves, and then you had not just one master rune per weapon or per item, but you had up to 2 or 3 master crafted runes per dwarven weapon and armor. That's insane. Like, that is legit crazy. I'm not joking. The Dwarven High King's hammer was so heavily rune enchanted that what he could do was he could call down the fucking lightning like Thor and then whip some demon's ass with lightning. He could also throw the hammer, and wherever the hammer is, he activates the rune and it teleports him to where the hammer's at. So that's really badass. He just throws the hammer at a demon that's all the way up in the sky, and the hammer misses the demon by a slight smidgen. All of a sudden, boom, the dwarf gets teleported on top of the hammer through a bolt of lightning, and then he crashes that hammer down on the fucking demon, sending them both plummeting to the ground. The last cool thing about the dwarven rune is that he's also got a rune on his hammer, not the Anvil of Doom, although they have a shit ton of those, but he's got one where he is able to crash it against the ground and just see the ground split open, swallowing a bunch of beastmen and demons with it. So there is a lot of magical powers and a lot of runes that the dwarves had at this time. So when Malekith and the High King were close friends, the High King, when he died of old age, which is the first time it's ever happened in a dwarven society, he begged Malekith, because he saw the troubles already brewing between the elves and the dwarves. The elves are very delicate people, whereas the dwarves are very hardy. They like a tough handshake, whereas the elves aren't so easy to be shooken hands with somebody who's got dirt on their hands. And he begged Malekith on his deathbed. He said, Malekith, please keep the dwarves and the elves friends. Only you can do this. And then he passed away. Malekith, knowing everything there is about dwarves, he's actually been to Karaz-a-Karak. He's seen the capital of the dwarves. He knows everything there is about them. After the Sundering, where he, burns up to a crisp and gets his armor implanted into him Darth Vader style, he decides to do something very scummy. He decides the only way for him to capture Ulthuan is if the elves waged war against the dwarves. So how does he do that? He does this simply. He sends a few ships through magic, the Winds of Dar, which is the dark elven magic, which requires sacrifices and stuff like that. And what they do is they have most of the sea corsairs and the guys who are piloting the ship, they kill them one by one very slowly, weaning off the crew, telling the captain, oh, we just need one more body, just one more. And while the 3 mages, the sorcerers, work their magic with the blood, the life of their blood, to keep their ships concealed, they dock nearby dwarven settlements. And then they let out a bunch of shades, and the shades are highly trained assassins who are able to cleave a dwarf's head off before he knows that he's in danger. And from there, they assemble raiding parties, raining arrows down upon dwarven caravans, raining arrows down any dwarven rangers that they come across that are lightly guarded. This, of course, makes the dwarves suspect it's the elves that are doing this. And the reason why is because, as the Dark Elves say it, when you think of an axe, what do you think of? You think of dwarves. But when you see arrows, you think of elves. Because elves are the ones using arrows. The dwarves, they don't use that. That's too delicate of a thing. There's no excellent craftsmanship to a bow. They prefer crossbows, and those shoot out bolts. Bolts are much significantly different than an arrow. So, that's what they do. And after enough successful ambushes, they ambush a ancient dwarf, which is very rare. An ancient dwarf is like, whew, we're talking like the oldest a dwarf could get. And he's a runesmith too of Barak Var, which means he's a very highly prestigious dwarf. and the fact that he's a runesmith means that he's got a bunch of knowledge in his head that no one else knows how to do. Well, they ambush his ass and they kill him. Except that right there wasn't the first thing they've done. They've done several raids prior to this, and the High King was dealing with a lot of issues. So, with the Ancient Dead, many Dwarven kings demanded that's it. We're going to kill them. We're going to massacre every fucking elf we see. But the High King said, no, we must wait. We must wait. If you go out and kill a single elf, I demand none of your city guards help you. None of your soldiers help you. If you're going to do your own fucking self, and you're going to report back to me why the fuck you did it. And I will have a personal grudge against you. No one wanted to move against Gotrek Starbreaker except for the High King of Karak 8 Peaks. You see, Karak 8 Peaks at the time was a very wealthy settlement, and he's been personally vying for the High King's throne and wishing that Karak was no longer the capital of Dwarven Kingdom, but instead Karak 8 Peaks, because it's so rich and wealthy compared to Karak. He says, that's it, I announce a begrudgment against the High King Gotrek Starbreaker, because he will not go to war against the elves. Well, that didn't really end well for the king, because what happens during a begrudgment is the two dwarves get their beards tied together so they can't run away from each other by a bystander, which would be the king of Karak Kadrin was selected for this honor of tying the two beards. And Gotrek Starbreaker, despite being the oldest in the room, he looks at the king of Karak Kadrin and he goes, you tie this fucking tight. I want you to tie this really, really tight. You make sure. I want it tight. It's like, oh boy. Upon which they both grabbed their respective hammers and they duked it out. Now, this is where we get a nice piece of info about Gotrek Starbreaker. Gotrek Starbreaker is a tough motherfucker. He knows how to fight. And while he's fighting Varnif, they're exchanging blows. Finally, when they're down at their last breath, both of them, Gotrek Starbreaker looks him in the eyes and goes, you know, when I fought the Groby scum, I didn't do it by fighting clean. And he grabs the dwarf and nails him in the balls, which all the High Kings in the room, not High Kings, kings in the room, were wincing from seeing the amount of pain the guy was in. Upon which their beards were untied, and he held the peace for 8 years, despite the waves of grudges coming in. So to deal with the waves of grudges, he just said no elves were allowed in our cities at all. They're not allowed. They're just straight up not allowed. Don't kill them, but they're not allowed. And that's pretty much the bringing of the War of Vengeance. The next video where it's cover the first battle of the War of Vengeance. Hope you guys enjoyed. This has been Free 700. I am out. Peace. See you guys next time. And as always, comment down below what you guys think. Maybe you guys like the War of Vengeance. Maybe you guys want to see more of it. Comment down below.